Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 1 game from the Charlotte Summer GM-IM Invitational. Now, if you followed my last video, you know that I actually got a win in round 9 in the last round of the Chicago Open, and now we're in a whole new tournament, and it's June. So we've made it to the June 2019 games, and my first tournament in June was in Charlotte, at a place I've been before. If you followed the channel, you know I've played these closed events in Charlotte before. They typically hold them once every 3 months or so, and they're a really good opportunity to play strong opponents and get norms. So definitely up my alley. My opponent in this one was someone that, if you've watched the channel for a while, you may actually be familiar with, because I've tussled with him quite a few times, and it was none other than Gauri Shankar, who is actually an IM elect. He's currently an FM, but he's an IM elect with like maybe 6 IM norms, and is just looking to complete the rating requirement, getting to 2400. And I have no doubt he will get there eventually, because he always plays me really tough and has a really, really great understanding of chess. So Gauri's actually been a tough opponent for me for some time, and actually he's really beaten me quite a few times, I believe, since we've started playing. So definitely don't take that game for granted at all, and I was hoping to kind of challenge him in a new way in this one. So I was white, and I definitely learned my lesson from previous games, so I had a new way of trying to attack him in this one, and so without further ado, let's get into it. I'm with knight f3. Gauri went d5 and g3, and I figured knight f3 and g3 would be a nice treatment, because typically Gauri's very, very good in the openings, theoretically, so I wanted to challenge him pretty much on untested ground, if you will. So anyways, after g3, g6 was played, and this is actually a really solid way of playing against these fianchetto systems. It's to follow suit in fianchetto, when you get these kind of fianchetto Grunfeld positions, very similar to my round 9 game in the Chicago Open against Scott Raymer. So actually, the most recent game I'd played was actually in the same exact system, and I thought, instead of playing the way I did in that one, which was to go c4 without playing d4, I thought I'd change the treatment ever so slightly, because at the Chicago Open, I knew that Gauri was not playing, but was actually roaming the halls watching games, because he's actually from Chicago and has a lot of students that play in those events. So I wasn't quite sure if he'd actually seen my game against Scott Raymer while he was at the Chicago Open, and I thought, you know what, let's not find out. So after g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, I actually went for d4, which is different than what I'd played against Scott. Against Scott, I actually castled and went for c4, and we got this this reverse Grunfeld. Oops, no, it was knight takes d5, and we got this this fianchetto Grunfeld system. So instead of sort of waiting to see maybe what Gauri had cooked up there, I decided to go d4. And d4 actually leads to these very symmetrical structures, because after knight f6, castles, the position is completely symmetrical. And there have been a lot of games with c4, c6, cd5, and I think I actually discussed this when showing a game in this fianchetto Grunfeld line against international master Andrew Hong from St. Louis. And I discussed how these lines are so symmetrical, and it's really hard for white to prove an edge here. So instead of going down that path, I decided to play the move c3, which is a remix on my game against Andrew Hong from St. Louis. In that game, I actually went for a4, and it was actually, I think I went c3 and then a4, but I basically went for this a4 plan to try and take some space on the queen side, and pretty much just delayed c4 because I didn't like the c4, c6 structures. And my argument was, instead of trying to open up the position a tempo up, to play a little bit more cagey and see how Gauri reacted, because it's very unusual that white plays in such a unassuming way. So I thought by playing a little bit more unassuming, I might have an opportunity to trip him up at some juncture in the opening. So after c3, Gauri actually went for a5, and I wasn't sure if he was actually familiar with my game against Andrew Hong, because he actually, funnily enough, was in St. Louis when that tournament was going on. So it's funny, you happen to see the same types of players in the American Open chess circuit if you're playing enough. So it's really tough to say whether he's seen this game, but I was at least cognizant of the possibility. And because of that, I didn't want to follow suit with a4 like I did in that game against Andrew Hong. And honestly, what I discovered is that, by playing, the real thing in these fianchetto setups in the center, it's kind of a battle to see who breaks in the middle first. And what I learned from my game with Andrew Hong was that I went a4 and then black went knight bd7, and black was actually first to almost initiate the e5 break. And I had to very desperately stop it by going c4 myself. But the point is that normally the side that actually plays e5 or e4 first is the side that winds up being better because they have the space in the center of the board after that exchange. So instead of playing a4, I set about to try to make sure I break in the center first with e4, and I did that by starting with knight bd2. And the point is that if black continues with a4 and tries to take space in on the queen side, that's fine, but now I can go rook e1. And you can see now I'm going to be the first one to break in the middle with e4, which should facilitate my bishop getting activity on the long diagonal, and I think promises white a slight advantage. So that was kind of my reasoning here. So after knight bd2, black actually went c6. And now I went rook e1, again, preparing this e4 break. And note, again, that if black does something like a4, well, I can take, and, even though black might get a tempo on my rook on e4, I can just go back and argue that I have a little bit more space on the e-file and some pressure on the e7 pawn potentially with bishop g5 later. And that, black has space on the queen side, but maybe it's not a huge factor right now. And maybe even the a4 pawn is a potential target if the rook winds up moving. I don't necessarily agree with that because black may throw in the move a3 at some point to damage my pawn structure. But just to illustrate, white has some play in the center of the board. And note that c5 is very, very risky in these types of structures because you open up the bishop on that long diagonal. So if you see here, with both of us playing c6 and c3, we're pretty much trying to blunt each other's fianchettoed bishop. So this didn't happen, but it was something that I was thinking about, and I think this was kind of what I was angling for in the position. After rook e1, black instead went bishop f5, and this is a very interesting move because it just directly stops e4. And the question is, how can I get an e4 if it's guarded now 3 times? And the answer is to remove a defender. So I decide now to play knight h4 and challenge this bishop on f5. And my rationale was I'm not actually threatening e4 here because I didn't want all of those exchanges to take place. Note that when you have a space advantage, you want to keep minor pieces on the board, not trade them. And if I wind up playing e4 and 2 pairs of minor pieces come off the board, it's hard to imagine that my minuscule space advantage will really come to anything with those pieces off the board, and this knight on h4 being a wayward knight. But the point is with the knight h4 to actually take on f5 and secure the 2 bishops. So if black is insistent on not allowing me to play e4 and plays a move like e6, I'd probably consider snagging this bishop. And the point is I would argue that even though there's a clamp on the e4 square right now, just by playing a4 and maybe even like e3, I can argue that the 2 bishops advantage is a long-term play that I can kind of work into the position. And maybe I can play for the c4 break now instead of the e4 break. So that was kind of what I was angling for with knight h4. Another consideration was that if bishop e4 is played trying to kind of stop me from from pushing e4. I considered I could even play f3 here and then force the bishop back and then push e4 or take on f5. And even here I can actually consider knight takes e4, because after d takes e4, typically this type of pawn structure is actually quite dangerous for white, because the knight can't come back to f3 and it looks trapped. But here my bishop on c1 is covering the g5 square, so g5 doesn't actually trap my knight on h4. And okay, I also have the f5 square for my knight as well. But the point is that if e6 was on the board, then g5 might be a consideration if my bishop wasn't on c1. Point being that I'm securing the two bishops, and I thought an ever so slight advantage if he keeps it on this diagonal. Instead, Gauri decided to play bishop e6 and kind of agreed that the two bishops was not worth giving up. I think the other factor is he pretty much understands my style pretty well. We've played each other enough times that he's kind of keen on not allowing me these small, tiny pluses I tend to aim for. So very logical. The downside, though, with bishop e6 is that you do block the e-pawn, and the bishop on e6 is not super great unless this diagonal opens up, which he was anticipating. He was kind of anticipating that I would play e4 and that the bishop could come out to a new diagonal, so it does make sense. The point is that if you moved it anywhere else on the diagonal, there weren't really attractive squares. If you put on c8, you're pretty much undeveloping your piece. If you put on d7, it actually gets in the way of the knight and the queen in the center. And if you put on g4, I would have likely hassled him with h3 or f3 kicking that bishop. So e6 makes sense. After bishop e6, I played e4, which was my plan to open up the position. And a pair of minor pieces do come off the board now, but not two pairs. So I still thought that having this little space advantage, I have something to play for. Knight d7 was played. This is a reasonable move, preparing to challenge my bishop on e4 with knight f6. So knight d7, preparing knight f6. And I have a decision to make here, because it's kind of a question of how I want to develop the rest of my pieces. Where are the dream squares for my pieces? Where does my bishop on c1 want to go? Where is my knight? Is my knight going back to f3 or g2? I thought it was actually smarter to play knight g2. And the reason for that is I figured that this bishop was eventually going to pop out on d5 and challenge my bishop on e4 here. And I thought if I was able to catch that bishop on d5 with knight f4 and secure the two bishops, that would be something to aim for. So I thought, you know what, that is the way to go. So I went knight g2, preparing knight f4. Black now went knight f6, and this is actually the first new move in the position, I believe. There was actually a game where bishop c4 was played, and this move is actually quite interesting because on this diagonal, it's relatively secure, and it can even pop over to a6 if I challenge it. So very, very interesting way to play with bishop c4, but knight f6 is also logical, challenging my bishop on e4. And I really wanted to play knight f4 to hit at this bishop on e6. But what I noticed was that if I play knight f4, black actually has the intermediate move knight takes e4. And if I play knight takes e6, there's knight takes f2. And this type of position fizzles out relatively quickly because after the subsequent exchanges, it's actually black that seems to have the better of it in my opinion. So I didn't really want to go for this. So instead, after knight f6, I actually had to retreat, and I played bishop c2. Part of my reason of playing bishop c2 was that I thought if I go bishop f3, then bishop d5 comes, and I wind up having to trade another pair of minor pieces, and so I wanted to keep some pieces on the board, and I thought bishop c2 was the best way to do that. After bishop c2, black actually decided to play very, very provocatively here, and I think it was a good choice because one of the sort of threats in the position that I was considering was this positional exchange sacrifice with rook takes e6. For instance, if black tries to take more space on the queen side with a move like a4, I can actually go rook takes e6 here, and after f takes e6, bishop takes a4, and the point is that my bishop can pop back to b3, challenge e6, and the light squares are very weak, and my knight on g2 might jump in to e6 eventually. So I thought this position could be quite promising. Note that playing bishop takes a4 here would not be a good move because it allows bishop g4 hitting my queen and challenging this bishop on a4 because my queen is kind of tethered to it. So if I went queen c2, bishop f5, and this would just be equality. Note that I can't go f3 because bishop takes f3. So yeah, I was actually angling for an exchange sacrifice with rook takes c6 if allowed. And again, Gauri was very alert and instead decided to move that bishop and played bishop g4. Bishop g4 is a provocative move, and the reason I say that is because I can actually kick this bishop away with f3. But the question is, do I want to do that? Because even though I get a tempo on this bishop on f3, and it appears that it doesn't have many nice squares to go to, because if you go to e6, I might exchange sack. If you go to f5, I might take on f5 with my bishop. And if you go to h3, I have knight f4 tempo. So it appears that f3 does challenge the bishop in a good way. But the issue with f3 is that this diagonal, the g1 to a7 diagonal, is extremely sensitive. So essentially what I was wrestling with was, do I want to weaken my diagonal for this tempo on the bishop? Is it worth it? Because I recognize that long term, this would be a structural concern for me with the second rank being so vulnerable. After f3. Whenever you push the f-pawn, your whole king side is vulnerable because your king no longer has shelter behind pawns. So, or shelter horizontally, rather. So that's why I was really thinking hard about it, but I decided to play f3 in the end. And the reason is because I thought queen d2 and queen d3 just weren't satisfactory. If I play queen d2, I'm blocking my bishop on c1. And if I play queen d3, I figured bishop f5 would come and we just trade bishops. And again, I just wasn't feeling these trades in this position where I actually am a touch less developed than black because I went for this e4 break and my bishop is still stuck on c1. So I didn't want to go for that, and I thought I needed to play energetically, so I did go for f3. After f3, black has a choice to make about what square to put the bishop on. And Gauri found a square I did not, take that seriously, but is actually quite okay, and it's the move bishop f5. And the reason bishop f5 is an okay move and quite interesting is because after this exchange on f5, black actually has a little bit better of a foothold in the center with the doubled f pawns, and that f5 pawn is not as bad as it looks because it can be reinforced with e6. So black's actually more solid than you'd think. And again, because I've played the move f3, my diagonal long term is sensitive. Now, instead of taking the bishop on f5, I could have also considered going bishop b3, but I thought it was maybe best to actually inflict structural damage to justify my f-pawn being moved, so I just thought the exchange would be sensible. But a position like this after bishop b3, b5, a4, this is quite playable for white also. And retaining the bishop gives me some chances on this diagonal, in particular f7. So, yeah, another interesting alternative. But instead we had the position with takes, takes, and now I decide I need to hurry up and finish my development, so I went for the move bishop g5. And my thought process was that eventually black is going to need to play e6 to defend the f5 pawn, and this will be a pin. And then in some lines, I considered maybe playing queen d2 and bishop h6, getting rid of these bishops, because I thought then the king would feel pretty airy, given the fact that these pawns are doubled. So that was my general idea. But I did recognize here that black is relatively solid in the middle, and that, it's probably not much for white. After bishop g5, black played e6, and now I went knight f4, and the idea was to converge again on the pin on this diagonal. Black went h6, I went bishop h4, just keeping that pin. You could also argue that I could take on f6, and after bishop takes f6, play king h1 and try to get counterplay on the g file. But I just didn't see this, being anything too serious, and I thought black could probably go king h8 or king h7 and rook g8 and follow suit. And I thought I wasn't a little bit slow with this g4 idea, so I thought against it. But it actually turns out if the king goes to h7, I always have queen d3 with an annoying pin on the f-pawn, and then g4 comes into play. So the king would have to go to h8, and maybe there are some drawbacks of being on h8 because the h6 pawn is unprotected. So who knows? Instead, after bishop h4, black now went queen d6, getting out of the pin, and I went king g2. I thought this was a reasonable move, protecting the f3 pawn, overprotecting it, and I was also, even entertaining an endgame in some positions. I was kind of hoping that black would consider playing c5, because I thought after d takes c5, queen takes e5, my king is now out of the diagonal, right? That was another reason to step up to g2. And I thought these endgames would be favorable for me, having a 3 versus 2 on the queen side. So I thought this queen side pawn majority would offer me decent chances. And I really like the move a4 here, which fixes black's pawn on a dark square and pretty much gives me the majority here, which I thought was nice. And I might be able to follow it up with queen e2 and rook d1 and just have a nice, safe, pleasant edge. So this was something I was considering. But actually, maybe I start with queen e2 because e5 might be a little bit dangerous, and I want to stop that one as well. But yes, c5 was not played, and I think it's quite impressive here that Gauri kind of showed really good discipline, just being very patient and not playing for any breaks, because if you open the position with some structural deficit, you're at risk. And so I think it was wise that he was patient, and he went for the move king h7, which is actually quite logical given the fact that my king is actually still on g2. With king h7, you consider playing a move like rook g8, but you also protect the h6 pawn in some lines. So it's actually quite a reasonable move. After king h7, I went a4. That was a move I always wanted to play to kind of fix this pawn on a5, and it seemed like this was the most desirable time to do it. One thing that I was wary of in certain positions was black going a4, and this pawn is actually extremely annoying because if I play a3, now my b2 pawn is backward, and I have these weak light squares. And if I just leave it on a4, black might go a3 at some juncture, and this a pawn can be a real menace if I leave it there, and if I push, or if I take, my whole queenside structure is ruined. So I really was happy to play a4 to kind of fix the structure. So after a4, black went rook g8, following with his plan of now playing on the g file. And I think in some world, black was actually thinking about queen takes f4 as a possibility, right? If the rook is lined up against the king and the bishop moves away, the f4 knight is actually a concern. So I went queen b3 now, hitting the b7 pawn, but this was actually a step in the wrong direction. A better move would have been queen d3, and the point is that I keep my queen close to my king side, and I also eye the pin on this diagonal, because there are some lines where g4 is a possibility because the king is now in h7. So something to have considered. And the point is that if the king is actually on h8, the bishop can't go back there. And so that's a problem, because if the bishop can't go back to h8, then the knight on f6 is hanging. So in many of these lines, it's actually quite good to have my queen on this diagonal. So after queen d3, black went, queen d3 was not played, queen b3. And after queen b3, black went queen c7, protecting that pawn. Logical. And I went for the move queen c4. And I like this move because I thought it just prevented b5. b5 was a move I was very wary about. Note that if I play a move like king h1, for instance, I thought b5 could be very scary after c takes b5 and c takes b5, queen takes b5. And for some reason I was seeing ghosts with rook g b8, and I thought there could be counterplay on the b file. But here, of course, queen e2 just protects everything. So maybe I was panicked for no reason, but I just thought with queen c4, I'm doing a good job of just stopping b5 altogether, because a takes b5 pins the c pawn. And I also gave my queen a highway to go back home if needed. After queen c4, black went rook a c8, and I think this is, logical. Keep making sure the queen is protected, and this is no longer a pinned. But okay, a takes b5 is not really an idea now anyway, because I just win a pawn. But reasonable enough. And now I went for rook e2. And my idea with rook e2 is that I defend the second rank horizontally, so that if the b file opens up, my rook is protected, or my rook is protecting it. And I thought on some lines maybe I can even double rooks. And really, I would love to play through the middle of the board. So I was thinking that in some positions, maybe knight takes e6, giving up a piece for 3 pawns would be an interesting choice, because if black kind of shuffles, I might be able to get some type of initiative like this. And my point is that I'm hitting the knight on f6, my rooks are both super active, and I'm going to win a 3rd pawn with queen takes f5 check. So I was kind of wondering how playable this is, and okay, it probably is not a winning position for white, but I thought there might be some pressure here, like if king h8, queen takes f5, my rook is threatening e7, I'm threatening f6. Okay, obviously I should have taken an f6 here after king h8, but let's say a better move like rook f8 is played. Maybe takes here. And it looks like there's some pressure here. I mean, it looked to my eye like there could be some initiative if I'm able to sacrifice on e6. So that's what I was looking at. After rook e2, black played knight d5 though, and that kind of put an end to these ideas, because if my queen can't actually get into e6, it's not really worth it to get that sacrifice. And the other issue with knight d5 now is that my knight on f4 is very sensitive, and the g files might get opened up. So yeah, it was actually a really nice and well-timed knight d5 move to kind of slow down my initiative. And the issue is if these knights come off the board, it's really tough to say why I'm better at all, because structurally black is actually quite solid on the light squares, and yeah, doesn't really have any terrible pieces. I felt obliged to play knight takes d5. I thought retreating didn't make much sense at all, so I took on d5. And after c takes d5, queen takes c7, rook takes c7, we have an endgame. And I thought in this endgame I would have a slight advantage based upon the fact that my rook could activate to b3 via a3. But what I discovered, or what dawned on me when I actually got to this position, was that if I go rook a3, black has rook c4. And the problem is my rook on a3 is kind of tied to the a4 pawn, so I can't actually go grabbing the b7 pawn. And there's a line that goes rook a3, rook c4, rook b3, rook b8 first just to defend the b pawn. And now I don't want to go back because then I'm super passive, but I can actually go g4, and I saw this. And my point was that after g4, the bishop pops out to g3 and challenges the rook on b8. But the issue here is that black can actually play f4, and this is actually where I stopped my calculations, because I figured that if my bishop can't get to this diagonal, it doesn't really make sense for me to go for this line. It turns out that I can actually play bishop e7 here and still get to the diagonal, but after bishop f8, this position is actually totally fine for black, and actually is easier to play black, because black is now going to recover the a4 pawn. Note that I can't go b3 because rook takes c3 comes. And this pawn on f4 is extremely annoying. It's very, very annoying because it's kind of a wedge in my king side, and it also makes my king very, very vulnerable and lack mobility. So it actually turns out that black would have the better of this particular structure. So instead of playing rook a3, I actually decided to play g4 right away. And g4 is a mistake. And the reason g4 is a mistake is, again, because of this move f4. And I really underestimated the strength of this f4 move, but essentially the issue is that f4 really weakens my king. Like if somehow a black rook was ever on the second rank, you could see how my king would be forced to the first rank because this f4 pawn doesn't allow me to step up in the position, and that's a huge problem. The other thing that's difficult about it is it's a very, very difficult pawn to get rid of. If I try to chase it down with like bishop e1 and bishop d2, black could easily respond with bishop f6 and bishop g5, or maybe even better, bishop f8 and bishop d6. And from d6, he would protect that f4 pawn and also the queen side. So as long as this f4 pawn stays on the board, it actually is very, very annoying. And not to mention the fact that black might have counterplay with h5 after the bishop on g7 moves. And that h5 g4 tension would be positive pawn tension for black, because I can never want to take on h5 because I open up this g file for counterplay, and black can pretty much take on g4 whenever he wants. So f4 is a very, very annoying move, and it was actually in this position that I realized that I'm actually the one playing for the draw, because I don't have any really critical levers here to open my position. No pawn breaks. Note that if I play c4, I weaken d4, right? If I push the b pawn, I weaken c3. And okay, I can't push g5 because the h pawn is there. So I really have no pawn breaks in this position. And, as I've said before, no pawn break, no plan. So here I realized I really need to bunker down and hold the game. So I tried to do that. I went king f2. My idea was to first bring my king towards the queen side and kind of shore up my pawn structure here. Black played bishop f8. I now went bishop f6, trying to reroute my bishop onto a new diagonal now that this bishop left this one. Black played bishop d6, and I went h4, trying to take a little bit of space on the king side to make h5 less powerful. I thought that if h5 is played, I could go g5, and my bishop on f6 would be well covered. So king g6 was played, though, challenging my bishop right away. And here I made another mistake. I went for the move bishop e5, trading those bishops, but a much better move would have been the move g5. And the reason for this is that this bishop on f6 can't be evicted. And I was actually worried about the h4 pawn, but you can't really chase it with your king, because then my rook could swing to h1 and it'd actually be checkmate. So for instance, let's say king h5, rook d2, king takes h4, rook h1 is mate. So you actually can't just chase the h pawn. And if I'm actually able to hold my bishop on f6 and keep this construction, you can see I limit black's activity on the king side, and my bishop controls the all-important h8 square. So there actually could be a scenario where black is actually obliged to play h5 and shut down the king side, because I might threaten h5 myself. Or I might go rook e1 and rook eg1 and just get activity on the g and h files. So g5 was a little bit better. Instead, I went bishop e5, and then we had another exchange. And already here, I have to be very, very alert, because if somehow black is able to get a file for one of his rooks, this f4 pawn is like a thorn pawn in my position, weakening my king and relegating it to the last two ranks. And so I really have to be careful not to allow any files to be opened up. Black now went rook c6, trying to invade, because I think Gauri saw the opportunity here. It looks, to the mind's eye, like black has more activity than white. I went h5 check, trying to kick the king back. I could have started with rook a3, but h5 check is what I played. And after king f6, I went rook e2, trying to just close the hatchet, protect b2, and kind of wait. Black now went king e7, and I thought this move was not very good. I thought instead a better move would have been rook b8, trying to prepare b5. And one thing that always concerned me, that if I run my king over to the king side now, or to the queen side now, I thought black could actually stay on g5, and in some positions, if things get exchanged, king h4, king g3 just wins a pawn endgame. So I was actually very, very wary, actually, of the king just invading via h4, and this scared the bejesus out of me. So I was very happy when king e7 was played. The computer, by the way, considers this position to be close to equal, but I'm not so sure it sees some of the human dangers here that exist, because it's very easy to me that for white to go wrong rather than black. The only thing black needs to worry about is not to allow g5 breakthrough in a pawn endgame, and it's very unrealistic that it can happen, because black can always throw in f6. So anyways, after king e7, I went rook c1, and now king d7, and then king e1. And I'm moving my king over towards the queen side. So f6, king d2, rook b8, rook a1 back now, kind of guarding against the b5 break. I want to have my rook on the a file to prepare for that. And then rook bc8, rook c1, rook b6, now hitting b2, and I have to be extremely careful because if I go for a move like rook b1, it looks kind of passive. This rook might be able to come into b3. I don't know. Or actually, even better than that, rook c4 is actually a move because now I can't go rook a1 because rook takes a4. And if I go b3, rook takes a4 anyway, takes advantage of this pinned rook on b1. So again, I have to be very, very careful here not to drop a pawn. And you could just see that black's rooks are more active than white's. But okay, I was a little bit more alert, and after rook b8, I went king c2. And king c2 holds together the pawn on b2 and also stops the rook from coming into b3. And after rook bc6, I went king d3, rook b6, king c2, rook c6, king c3, rook b6, and we actually agreed to a threefold repetition in this position, and the game was drawn. I was pretty pleased that I held this game. It actually turns out that I wasn't losing during this rook endgame, but I thought I definitely had a scare because it felt like I was in control for like 3/4 of the game until we got to this endgame, and all of a sudden I was kind of on my heels. I think all in all, I got a very interesting and original position, and Gauri just played pretty well. He defended well. He didn't really go for a lot of the tricks, and he didn't allow the exchange sacrifice. He didn't allow any of the nuances I was trying to get in the position that gave me a little rub. And I think it was a fairly well-played game. So I'll take it. A draw that's a fairly well-played is not necessarily the end of the world. Anyways, there are 8 rounds to go and plenty more chess to be played. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.